Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We have a great episode for you this week with Ambassador Dennis Ross joining us to discuss President Donald Trump's visit to the Gulf, the status of the Netanyahu-Trump relationship, the present and future of the Gaza war, U.S. foreign policy big picture, and Dennis's reflections on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which you definitely want to hear. Dennis Ross is, of course, the Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a former senior official and Middle East envoy in the Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, and Obama administrations, including as a lead envoy and negotiator during the Oslo peace process in the 1990s. And finally, he is also the author of the new book called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World, out now. In the interest of full disclosure, Dennis was my boss at the Washington Institute back in the day, twice. There are a few people who can meld current affairs and historical analysis and personal experience, trust me, like Dennis can. It was all on display in the coming hour. I hope you enjoy the conversation just as much as I did. Let's get into it. Hi, Dennis. Welcome to the Israel Policy Pod.
Neri, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's really my pleasure, Dennis. As we touched on before we started recording, been meaning to do this for a while, and I thought I'd pick the correct week, and I think this week, with everything going on, is the correct week. For our listeners, they should know we're recording this Wednesday afternoon Tel Aviv time, and President Trump is still in the midst of his first official overseas trip to the Gulf. Saudi Arabia yesterday and earlier today, Qatar currently, and then the UAE tomorrow. Pointedly, Israel is not on the itinerary, unlike his first maiden voyage as president in his first term, which was Saudi to Israel. That's not happening this time. But I wanted to start here, Dennis, as a veteran of what I can only imagine are countless presidential visits and summits to and in the Middle East. What do you think of this one, at least so far? The optics, the rhetoric, the potentially $1 trillion in business deals about to be signed?
Look, one of the things that characterizes President Trump is he is not, this isn't a gross understatement, he's not your typical president. His approach to foreign policy rivets less on traditional geopolitical interests, less on security architecture questions, less on alliances. There is a worldview that is shaped very much by bilateral ties and everything with a huge emphasis on the economy, on deals. He's a transactional president. He understands that in his mind, what matters more than anything else are business deals with big numbers. So we're seeing the announcement of $142 billion in terms of defense projects. And then there's talking about $600 billion over the next 4 years of investments in the U.S., American company investments in the region. The numbers right now, whatever they're declared, the reality of delivering those numbers, it will probably never completely match up. But there is an interesting irony this time. I do think if you go back to his first term, where again, he announced huge numbers of deals that would be struck as a result of his visit to Saudi Arabia, then the gap between what he said and what was actually delivered was huge. This time, there'll still be a gap just because it takes years for some of these things to materialize, and some will never fully materialize. I think the New York Times was saying when they added everything up at this point, it's $283 billion. But okay, let's say it goes beyond that. There is an irony. Many of the deals struck were prepared during the Biden administration. That's even more true when it will come to the UAE, which is talking about $1.4 trillion over 10 years. This is $600 billion over 4 years. That $1.4 trillion grows very much out of discussions that were done by the Biden administration to develop what will be major investments in AI with the UAE. And the terms of protecting American technology were hashed out in the Biden administration because there was a concern about, look, this is such a cutting edge technology that we can't allow the Chinese to gain access to it. So a lot of the preparatory work was done during the Biden administration. But the reality is that many of these deals are being closed right now, in no small part because you have the Gulf states who understand with President Trump, one way you build his stake in you is by doing deals. Again, more traditional presidents focus more on a set of security arrangements. This is not a traditional president, but when you do $142 billion in defense contracts, the largest ever, you are creating a reality where there's an American presence in Saudi Arabia in the security domain that will be enduring, and the investment in major parts of Saudi, different Saudi sectors, including AI. They have one virtue that the UAE doesn't have. They have a lot of space. Data centers require a huge amount of space. The Saudis have that. In the case of the UAE, they will be investing in American companies here because we have the space. Here you have a case of, in the Saudis, you have a case of investment of American companies in Saudi Arabia. But that also, from Trump's standpoint, and he will say this, that builds our stake in them. And they have an interest in us having a stake because the likelihood of a defense treaty between the Trump administration and the Saudis, I think, is very low for a variety of reasons. I don't think that he's a huge fan of defense alliances because they imply a set of obligations. As I say in my book, there is an American tradition that Trump reflects. America First is an American tradition. I don't mean from the 1930s. I mean from really the 19th century.
Right.
We were activists internationally, but not with alliances, because alliances limited our freedom of action. And that's very much kind of who President Trump is. So I look at this trip as he is achieving what he wants, but to be fair, the Gulf states also believe that they're building his stake in them, and that will serve their security interests, not just their economic interests.
And in terms of issues, economics aside, and even alliances or not, and personal relationships, building those, did anything stand out to you in terms of the speech he gave, what was it, last night, Tuesday night in Riyadh, in terms of Iran, the Gaza war, even the issue of he went back and slammed the neocons and the interventionists who he said, did nothing. On those more ideological issues, did anything stand out to you?
Yeah, let's start with the ideological issues. Because again, it kind of fits who he is. We will not be interventionists. We will not be nation builders. We will focus on sovereignty. What countries do internally is their own business. This is not an administration of values. This is an administration of interests. Every administration, to be fair, every president, there's a continuum of interests and values.
Right.
Some presidents tilt more heavily towards interests, but they never give up values. Others tilt more heavily towards value, but they never give up interests. And in this case, there's not really a spectrum. There's just one. And that's right. Who he is. So it's important to recognize. So that's my first observation, that this was an opportunity for him to, again, repeat what his philosophy is for foreign policy, which is, he said it in his inaugural address, especially when he said, we will measure success not by battles won, but by the wars ended and the wars we don't get into. So what you heard yesterday was the interventionism. We're against that. And the neocons, because they basically produced the interventionism. And the nation builders. And those who wanted to export democracy. This is not who he is. So we got a very clear reminder, that number one. Number two, his style of approach. No permanent enemies. This relates to interests, and not just interests. This relates to values. No permanent enemies. That means you can pretty much talk to anybody. This is an administration that, as you know, talked directly to Hamas. No administration's done that.
Right.
Because in a sense, nobody is, in a sense, off limits. and so you talk directly to Hamas. In addition, I would say with the Iranians, he staked out two positions. You're not going to have a nuclear weapon. You got to stop supporting troublemakers in the region. Okay. I want to do a deal with you, but you can't have a nuclear weapon. Now, not having a nuclear weapon gives you a lot of space for an outcome. They don't have a nuclear weapon today. The issue will become, already has become, will they have enrichment, domestic enrichment?
Right.
The administration sent mixed signals before. Now it's sending a signal, no domestic enrichment. That will become a very interesting test. Iran needs a deal. Again, one of the interesting things in the new book, which we'll get into, I have a long chapter on Iran, going through the whole history of every administration from Carter to today, their approach to the Iranians, what tended to work, what didn't tend to work. And Iran did make the Islamic Republic made tactical adjustments and concessions when they felt it was important for them to do so, almost always under pressure. Those who say pressure doesn't work on Iran, they ignore Iran's actual behavior. Actually, pressure does work. It doesn't mean it works if you don't give them a way out. It doesn't mean you always get exactly what you want, but they will adjust their behavior. Will they go along with absolutely no enrichment? My guess is probably not, unless they think the consequence could be that they lose their entire nuclear infrastructure that they've invested in for the last almost 40 years with more than $500 billion. Maybe they might do that. I suspect still probably not, because it's too much of a surrender for them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of ways even short of that. I mean, for example, you could be allowed to enrich, but then everything you enrich has to be shipped out of the country, so you get your fuel rods from outside. The virtue of that is they would have a face saver in terms of being able to enrich, but they couldn't accumulate any fissionable material, and you'd have to have that completely monitored and verified. But if they can't accumulate any fissionable material, then they can't build a bomb.
Right.
So the objective, again, this comes back to good statecraft is marrying objectives and means. The objective needs to be that Iran is giving up its nuclear weapon option. It's not enough saying you won't have a nuclear weapon. You want the Iranians to demonstrate, not because they say it, but because either the structure of their program or the way you've set it up in terms of shipping out, or because there's no enrichment, means they're giving up the option. So what he's saying, no nuclear weapons, is a kind of interesting elastic standard. There's a lot of different ways to achieve that, and we'll have to see. Does Steve Witkoff, if he comes to Trump and says, look, we can get a deal if we allow this kind of enrichment and this kind of ship out, but we can't get a deal if we allow no enrichment, does he then say, that's it, no deal? If you look at the way he negotiates on tariffs, stakes out maximal positions and then makes adjustments. That seems to be the character of how he negotiates. So I would be, I guess, surprised if we didn't see something similar in this case, but we'll have to see. The only other thing that struck me is, he clearly wants the war in Gaza to end, but we're not yet seeing actions that reflect that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we may be on the brink of it. The release of Elon Alexander, the fact that it was done by us, that it was done without Israeli involvement, and now you have Witkoff telling the families that he's optimistic there can be a deal. We'll see. If there's going to be a deal, my guess is that it probably almost has to happen while Trump is still in the region, or almost immediately afterwards. And so we'll see
because of the looming threat of the Israeli offensive into Gaza, or other reasons?
No, I think it's because Trump would like to demonstrate his successes. And so getting a deal while he's there is another manifestation of his success. He can claim it as a triumph. Or if it happens immediately afterward, where he can come out and say, this is, I went to the region, look what we did. So I think that's it. I think the looming Israeli threat, certainly it has an impact on the Qataris, on the Egyptians as well. On Hamas, I'm less certain. If Hamas cared at all about the Palestinian public, they would have found a way out of this war a long time ago. And their readiness to sacrifice the Palestinians in Gaza has been demonstrated over and over and over again. Not only they see the sacrifice as serving their interest because it stigmatizes Israel. And they're no longer a military, but they're still a terrorist organization, and they can engage in an insurgency in Gaza. There's a lot of unexploded ordnance, which they turn into IEDs. So you've seen Israel lose soldiers lately. So they can function as a terrorist group and as an insurgency. Yeah, they fired 3 missiles yesterday. As a military, they have basically been destroyed. The question is, can you produce an outcome where they can't reconstitute or rebuild themselves? I think you can. But what we need to see is, does the Trump administration have an approach to the day after? And we haven't really seen it. We've seen the emergence of a plan for how to distribute aid, humanitarian aid. I mean, we haven't seen all the allies, but we've seen something begin to emerge. We haven't seen anything. The only way this war can really end is not only with the release of hostages, but if you also have an alternative to Hamas, something the Israeli government this Israeli coalition has shied away from developing or wanting to develop.
Yes, listeners of this podcast are well versed on that issue in terms of no day after plan, no post-war plan, and the looming offensive and what it could mean. We had our friend Michael Milstein on last week, and he's not a dove, and as he likes to say, he's not naive, and even he says this could be a disaster for Israel if it goes ahead. I assume we'll find out in the coming days. Dennis, you kind of beat me to the punch. I wanted to get into more of U.S. Israel relations, but fair to say it's more Trump-Bibi relations. You have more Bibi hours, as it were, than probably most non-Americans, going back to at least the 1990s, I think. The conventional wisdom, at least on my end here in Israel, is that Netanyahu and Trump are now on the outs, or at the very least not as close as they used to be, definitely on a slew of policy issues. You mentioned negotiating directly with Hamas by American officials. I can't imagine what the reaction would have been if you had tried something like that, or a Biden administration official had tried something like that, but that's a different issue. The Iran nuclear talks, ending the military campaign against the Houthis, even as of yesterday and even today, lifting sanctions over Syria and meeting with the new Syrian president, Julani al-Shara. So how would you assess, as a veteran Bibi watcher and also as a veteran U.S. diplomat, the relationship between Bibi and Trump today?
I think the notion that they were really close was always a misperception, a mischaracterization. I think Bibi did have influence on Trump in the first term, but every place where he had influence on Trump in the first term was a place where Trump wanted to go anyway. Trump said the JCPOA was the worst deal ever done. And so the idea he would walk away from it, he didn't need Bibi's encouragement to do it. Bibi might have helped enable it by basically being able to ferret out of Tehran in one of Mossad's amazing coups, the entire nuclear archive, and then being able to show what was in it to Trump in advance, gave him an excuse or a pretext to do what he wanted to do anyway. Did he need that pretext? Probably not, because he wanted to do it anyway. I mean, he overruled his Secretary of State as National Security Advisor and his Secretary of Defense, who didn't want to do that. So it wasn't because of Bibi, it's because of where he was coming in. So you know what he wrote about with regard to the killing of Soleimani. Mm-hmm. How he said that Bibi had backed out of it. So he is someone who has had a position towards Israel that is certainly favorable in terms of fundamentally supporting Israel. But I think what one needs to understand with Trump is he will always do what he considers to be in his interest, and his interests and America first are sort of synonymous. And where there's a Trump interest or an American interest, what he's demonstrated, that comes first. So the idea of striking a deal with the Houthis, even though within less than 48 hours beforehand, Ben Gurion Airport, at least the environments around Ben Gurion Airport, are hit by a ballistic missile.
Mm-hmm.
The deal has nothing to do with what Houthi does towards Israel, including towards Israeli ships, which, by the way, the way they define anything connected to Israel ships, it is the most elastic definition I've ever seen. So anybody who has a non-American flagged ship, which is a very small minority of the ships that use the Red Sea, is probably not going to test that proposition. So number one, this was done without the slightest concern for the Israelis. As we said, talking to Hamas, not done by any previous administration, without the slightest concern for the Israelis. Sure. Who does he says he talks to Erdogan and he talks to MBS and he decides he's going to meet him and he's going to lift all the sanctions. I didn't hear Bibi's name mentioned in that. So we have a litany of moves that demonstrate. It doesn't mean he's hostile to Israel. I don't believe that. I don't think he is. But it does mean he makes his decisions on what he considers to be in America's interests. It is America first. It's not America and Israel first. It's America first.
Mm-hmm.
Look, even when Bibi was here, and obviously ostensibly he was coming for the tariffs, which he achieved nothing on, by the way.
Right.
It was obvious that he was coming for Iran, and he was surprised that in his presence, the president went ahead and announced that there would be direct talks with Iran the coming Saturday. This was a Monday. But even on the issue of the tariffs, how did he respond? Didn't give him anything. He said, "We give you $4 billion a year." So, I think one needs to have a clear-eyed view of this. He can have I believe he will continue to be generally supportive of Israel. But when something is in what he sees as American interests, those come first. One really interesting measure. He wants to win the Nobel Prize. He's not going to get it for Russia-Ukraine. He's not going to get it for Iran deal because I think in the best case, what you're going to see is a framework agreement, something that could be equivalent. Now, I don't mean, it's not analogous to it in a literal sense, but a framework agreement like the JPOA, where you had
the precursor.
The Obama administration negotiated what was the precursor to what became the JCPOA. You could get a framework agreement that is similar in the sense maybe it's a freeze, maybe they downblend all their 60%, maybe we lift a few sanctions. And this is done to sort of buy time to do a larger deal so that the immediacy of the threat is dealt with. I wouldn't be surprised by that. So you might see that, but what that will mean? It will mean Israel can't act militarily against the Iranian nuclear program. And there is a window here because Iran doesn't have an air defense today, at least an air defense that can be effective against Israel. And it is feeling a real crunch economically. It's the devaluation of the currency is extraordinary. They have electricity shortages which require blackouts, rolling blackouts. Sometimes, 24 of 31 provinces have had to close the schools, close businesses, and close government offices because of shortage of electricity. This is a country that produces natural gas and oil, and yet it has shortages of electricity. This is a country that is running out of water. And at some point, that will be a major source of instability. It needs a deal. So if it gets a framework agreement, which removes the military threat, gives them time to rebuild their air defense, gives them time, gives them some sanctions relief. It won't be a panacea for them, even if they had a full-fledged deal, because banks will still be reluctant to do business in Iran so long as there are anti-terrorism laws on the books, anti-laundering laws on the books. And they don't address that. They don't open up their banking system. As long as there are human rights, sanctions on the books. A lot of the financial institutions will be very hesitant to go ahead and go into Iran. We saw that, by the way, after the JCPOA. You literally had John Kerry going to Europe trying to encourage businesses to go into Iran.
That's right.
That's true, but the kind of tremendous benefits economically they're not going to get, although the Iranians seem to know how to try to appeal to President Trump. They're saying, you can build up our nuclear industry here. There's trillions to it by that. So again, I say all this your question because what he defines as being in American interest is going to come first. I come back to the issue of the Gaza war. One thing he heard in Saudi Arabia was, we're not against doing normalization, but nothing can even begin until the war in Gaza ends and the IDF is out. And even then, we're going to require something credible on the Palestinians. Those who say they know what they want on the Palestinians, there's room to negotiate on that. But it is a factor. So for Trump, it's the only place he can get a Nobel Prize is here. At some point, his attitude on the Gaza war is going to express itself in a more direct way. And I suspect he will say at some point to Bibi, I gave you a lot of time. I gave you kind of a blank check, but I didn't give you forever. So I think that comes. Maybe we'll see a deal done right during the end of his trip or immediately after it that produces what Witkoff has been proposing, which is a release half the living hostages on day one and have a 45-day ceasefire. And I think Witkoff certainly seems to be conveying, at least this is the impression of the Egyptians and the Qataris, that he will do everything he can to try to then produce an end to the war in that 45-day period. Maybe we'll see this sooner rather than later. I'm just not sure about that. But I do think at some point, Trump's position is going to be, okay, I gave you the time. Now it has to end. So I guess the basic issue here, coming back to the heart of your question, where it becomes an issue of what is in Trump's interest and those that don't align with Bibi's interest, then there'll be a problem. And Trump will go ahead and do what he sees as being in America's interest.
There'll definitely be a problem for Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli right, who pinned a lot, if not everything, their hopes and dreams on the outcome of last November's general election and the re-election of Donald Trump. Take it from me, the Israeli right here is already turned on Donald Trump in some remarkably very frank and direct language on their part, on television and the usual mouthpieces. He's disappointed them. I don't think Donald Trump probably cares. My fundamental question is,
I want to add one other point to this. Maybe with a Democratic president, he always had the Republicans that he could go to, and the Republicans would also, they would shore up parts of the Jewish community as well. He does not have that now. He doesn't have someone he can go to create a pressure on Trump. He may think the evangelicals, that would be his today that would be his natural community, but they don't dominate the Republicans on the Hill. There's no joint session of Congress that's going to be open and available for him and castigate, challenge the policies of the American president. That's not an option. So the context is very different.
That's a great point. There's no out to leverage one side of the aisle against the other, like Bibi has done for many years. And just on finishing up the Gaza question, Dennis.
Yeah.
Trump wants the war done concluded sooner rather than later. It's a question of how long Trump gives Bibi and Trump's patience, effectively. And Witkoff is trying to broker this deal. And I think Netanyahu himself says, I'll take the deal. Multi-week ceasefire, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, get half the living hostages out. But even Netanyahu said yesterday, after the deal runs its course, we're going to restart the war and go all the way to the end. We're not stopping. So how, you know him better than I do, how does Bibi reconcile those two pressures, what he's promising is public here and what the American president may want?
One of the things that I think has always characterized Bibi is the capacity to play for time. And something comes along and he figures something out or something helps to change the circumstance. I think he says, everybody, even even Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will accept this right now because it's not an end of the war. He's saying it's not an end of the war. We're going to go back in so they can accept this. And he can say, look, at least we can get maybe 10 or 11 more hostages out. So he can say that. The crux will come if there's a real seriousness on the part of President Trump and Witkoff to say, we can end the war at 45 days. This is what it requires. If he says no to that, then he's saying no to them. And then he has to worry about what the implications of that will be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they say to him, okay, it's up to you. It's out of our hands, and we're washing our hands of it. One also needs to be thinking about what does it mean if the U.S. washes its hands of it? I was worried when on Ukraine, when the threat was we might walk away. Well, if you walk away in one circumstance where you're also no longer supporting Ukraine, then you're giving Putin a big win. But if walking away means, okay, we're going to continue to support Ukraine, then you're basically saying to Putin, okay, let's see if time is really on your side after all. So it depends on if they decide to wash their hands of it, does that affect some of what they're doing with Israel? I don't know the answer to that. But Bibi will have to make that. Will have to make that choice, assuming they say, okay, you can continue this, but we're not going to be involved anymore. I'm not sure, as I said, I'm not sure what it means. In the end, a lot will depend upon, is the message the war has to end at 45 days, regardless of what Bibi's saying now? And he has 45 days to come up to position himself differently if it's going to end that way. Maybe coming to the administration and say, all right, look, produce something for me with Saudi Arabia, or produce a determination one way or the other on Iran. So that, if at the end of that 45-day period, you say the Iranians are not responding, then give me the green light to go against Iran. Then I could see him. At that point, I could see him saying, okay, Iran is the bigger issue, to have the right kind of support for that, to do what we need to do to focus everyone's attention on that, we've been on the war in Gaza. You could see there's a variety of different kinds of scenarios here. A lot depends upon where the Trump administration is in its negotiations with the Iranians, how much it wants to move on Saudi normalization, how quickly. That will heavily affect, I think, what Trump decides to do.
So that's a great transition to my next question about your book, about Statecraft. Explain to us.
I can hold it up if it helps.
It could. We are also a video podcast.
This is
yes, Statecraft 2.0. Because there was an original Statecraft book. This is new, not only just updated, but new, about the new moment in global affairs, the multipolar world order. I'm curious, just give us a sense how you define statecraft, why it's important, and then I'll ask you the kind of obvious question: where does the Trump administration fit into this rubric of statecraft?
So let me say, look, the essence of statecraft is using all the tools you have at your disposal. Statecraft is not diplomacy. Diplomacy is a tool of statecraft. The military is a tool of statecraft. Economics are a tool of statecraft. Intelligence is a tool of statecraft. Information, managing the information space, is a tool of statecraft. So all the tools you have at your disposal That makes up statecraft, number one. What makes for good statecraft? You marry objectives and means. That sounds completely obvious. I teach on this, and I always start the class off by saying, okay, that's a given, right? And my students nod and say, it's a given. And then I point out, it almost never happens. Why does it almost never happen? Because we don't adopt the right objectives. And we don't adopt the right objectives for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we have no idea what we're getting into. Actually, Trump was saying this yesterday about the interventionism, that we intervened and we had no idea of what we were getting into. He was right. Sometimes that happens. We certainly saw it in Iraq. Sometimes it's political factors that drive an objective. Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam didn't understand what he was getting into, but he had a political consideration above all others. He felt that the Republicans seized the loss of China and used it to gain enormous political advantage against the Democrats. He feared if Vietnam was lost, the same thing would happen. What he didn't realize is, and this is a classic example of understanding, there's always a tendency to understand the cost of action, but never the cost of inaction. Mm-hmm. That was really true, I think, for President Obama in Syria. He understood the cost of action, but he never understood the cost of inaction. In any case, there are political factors that sometimes determine an objective, and that should never be. It is always a factor, but it should never be the only factor. Sometimes you get into a situation with one objective and then you change. And in Somalia, George H.W. Bush, who generally practiced statecraft quite well, along with Jim Baker, we start off with, we're going to intervene militarily to end the famine there. And and we succeeded. And then we decided to expand the objective from ending the famine to taking on warlords there. Well, that suddenly put us in the middle of what was a civil war. So, we changed the objective. There's a variety of reasons you end up adopting the wrong objective, but if you adopt the wrong objective, you're never going to be able to match the right set of means to it. In any case, one of the reasons I wrote the book, you're quite right, I wrote a book on statecraft in 2006. Mm-hmm. It was a completely different world. It was a unipolar world. The Russians didn't resist us. The Chinese were still trying to build themselves up. They were still under the aegis of Deng Xiaoping, whose adage was, bide your time and hide your strength. Don't be provocative. As before President Xi, who comes along and says, dare to struggle. So we have a different world. We have a different world on the outside. We also have a different world on the inside. Even though there was division and debate over Iraq in 2006 when I was writing, there wasn't a fundamental debate over what our role in the world should be. There was a fundamental sense America needs to lead in the world. That's no longer the case. Whether in one of the chapters I go through the 5 different kind of arguments that are made about what our role in the world should be, including I start off with the American first view, quoting extensively from Trump's speeches in his first term, which we saw a replay of that in the speech in Riyadh, where he goes after, in a sense, the interventionists, the nation builders, those who in effect are trying to promote democracy. All of that was in that speech, just like it was in his speeches from 2017, 2018. So it's a different world, and I was writing to say, okay, in a world where we're more constrained on the outside and we don't have a consensus on the inside, we have to use all of our tools more effectively, because we won't be able to sustain a role, however we define it, if we aren't seen as being more successful, and that requires you to apply everything successfully. So then the book has a lot of history where I draw out examples of statecraft done badly and also examples of statecraft done well to distill the lessons, and then I apply it to China, Iran, and the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
Fascinating, important issues all. One of them closer to near and dear to our hearts, which we'll get into in just a moment. And in terms of Trump practicing or not statecraft, I mean, how unorthodox, how out of the norm is he in relation to previous U.S. presidents? Not just ideologically.
He's different. He's different, but look, an element of statecraft is leverage. for sure. I mean, he understands the principle of leverage. That's clear, but he defines it narrowly. When you give up soft power, which is the power of attraction, that's one of your tools. When you give up alliances, he sees alliances as a drag on us, but alliances actually can strengthen us. You look at every coalition we've created. First Gulf War, we had a coalition, and it was quite successful. The Obama administration didn't want to involve itself in Syria, but then when ISIS forced its hand, it put together a remarkable coalition. So alliances and coalitions are a source of strength. He tends to define things in a much more narrow way. Does he engage in statecraft? Yeah, because he does set out objectives. The question is, how clear are the objectives? It gets back to what I was saying before. Sometimes, if the objectives are stated at such a high level of generality, you can't translate them into action. Take the Riviera and Gaza.
Yeah.
Were there the means to be able to do that? No. But was he using that to try to force the Arabs to come up with something? Maybe. The only thing is, Egypt did come up with a plan. The problem was it was a half a plan. They answered the part of, could you do reconstruction without having to move all the Palestinians out of Gaza? The answer did, yes, you could, and here's how you would do it. And there was a plausibility to it. The problem was Hamas is never mentioned in the plan.
That's right.
And there wasn't an approach to demilitarization. There'll be no reconstruction in Gaza if there isn't demilitarization. If Hamas remains in control, even indirectly, who's going to invest in Gaza? Because they know Hamas will try to do this again. So, and if he wants to end the war in Gaza, this comes back, what's your objective? The Riviera and the Gaza was too high a level of generality, and there were no means to be able to produce it, but was it designed to be a lever? Just like tariffs. Tariffs are a means. They're not an end. So what is the end he seeks? Is it to change the terms of trade? Is it to change the structure of the American economy so that you bring back manufacturing here? Is it to generate more revenue because you're doing tax cuts and you need to generate more revenue to deal with our budget deficits? Those could be all three of the objectives. I think today you couldn't say which of those are the real objectives. I would say, if you ask me, I would say there are two of three. I think it is to change the terms of trade, and I think it's probably also to generate some revenue. It could be quite appropriate as a means to achieve those objectives. So he would be acting on statecraft there. If he wants to produce Saudi-Israeli normalization, if that's his objective, then there's a number of things he has to do to be able to achieve it. In other words, you can stake out an objective, but then you have to think through, okay, what are the means that you have to be able to produce it? What are the tools you're at? Sometimes how you frame an issue is actually critical. It's a critical means because, again, it draws others in. Sometimes taking the initiative is essential. Here, he heard in Saudi Arabia, you want to do normalization and the war in Gaza. It's not the sum of everything, but it's a start. So I think every president, no matter what they say, they're engaging in some kind of statecraft because they spell out objectives, and you can judge them by how well they do in terms of achieving their objectives. You can give them, when it comes to giving grades on statecraft, you can say, okay, that was an A, that was a B, that was a C, that was a fail. So we can judge him based on the objectives that he spelled out, how he does.
So I want to take you to a more personal space now with the time remaining. Don't worry, it'll still focus on policy, but I'm going to use our time wisely. First question to you, Dennis. If you were being sent by this U.S. president, or maybe any one of your former bosses, and there were many former bosses, to Jerusalem for a late night meeting with Netanyahu at the prime minister's office, what would you advise the Israeli prime minister in this current moment in time, 19 months after October 7th, 58 hostages still in captivity in Gaza? Now he's threatening a renewed offensive, as we talked about. What would you go there to counsel him? Obviously, with the caveat that as envoy and diplomat, you serve at the what do you call it? The the pleasure, not the leisure, but the pleasure of the U.S. president. Yes,
Yes, you're at the pleasure of president.
the pleasure of the president. But leaving that aside, what would you actually tell this Israeli prime minister if you had to go meet them right now?
I think there's two things I would go with. The first I would go with would be, what's the most important issue for Israel today, in your mind? I mean, I would want him to define it to begin with. And then I would respond based on what he said. If you were to ask me what I would regard as being most important, which is not how you do it. I mean, you go see an Israeli prime minister, you're saying, okay, tell me, what is it you're really trying to achieve now? Or what is the most important thing? I would think in his mind, it's still Iran, because that's still an existential issue. But if he were to say, I have to succeed in Gaza, then I would say, well, let's talk about what is success. Now, one of the problems is, again, a good example of the political pressures. When Bibi first said the objective was total victory, total victory is a slogan, it's not an objective. So you would have to break it down and say, all right, what does that mean? How do you define it? If the criteria of success is the hostages, you have to recover all the hostages, which should be, because that's a social compact that every Israeli government has had with the Israeli public. You're all collectively, we can get into the issue of the Haredi, you're all collectively served, but our obligation to you is we'll do whatever it takes to get you back. So that is an overriding priority. It is also an essential reality that you don't want the outcome of this to leave Hamas in a position where it still controls Gaza, even if it's indirect. And I would say here, to achieve that objective, you need to be able to have an alternative to Hamas. And at this point, what are we? We're 600 days in.
Mm-hmm.
You had, one short ceasefire and then another longer ceasefire. But the fact is, you've had a lot of time to achieve the objectives. You didn't follow the advice of David Petraeus, which was to clear, hold, and build. I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do right now. I'm not quite sure how it looks different from what you've done before. But it looks like you're going to set yourself up for an insurgency that has no end to it, unless you're prepared to work to create an alternative. Now, the interesting thing is, the Egyptians came with a plan. What I would say is, let's turn that plan into something that produces the outcome you want. Not just the release of the hostages, but also an approach that guarantees that Hamas will not be in control. You have succeeded. They're no longer a military. They're not. They are no longer organized as a military. They no longer have the capabilities of a military. It doesn't mean they're with no arms. But at this point, you have an interest in creating an alternative administration on a transitional basis that could probably be an Arab-led with some other outside involvement, with some Palestinian involvement, some from the PA, a transitional basis, but with a ground rule that for those who want there to be the Palestinian state over time, even if you're not prepared to accept that at this moment, there has to be change on the Palestinian side. The Saudis, for example, I would say the Saudis can say we need a credible pathway to a state, but a credible pathway to a state has a series of actions by Israel, but also has actions by the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. If there's no reform, you're producing a failed state. If there's no fundamental change in the structure, there's no guarantee that this is a state that couldn't align with Iran. No guarantee that it couldn't have independent militias. So there's a series of things that would have to be worked out that address not just Israel's needs, but the collective needs of everyone. But I would focus heavily on, let's take that Egyptian plan, use the American readiness to support you on the kind of outcome where Hamas is not in control, empower this interim administration that would be a transitional administration, say, for at least 2 years. Let's choke off the oxygen for Hamas. So with the Egyptians, there has to be a regime that guarantees no smuggling. And this, you get the U.S. to say, this is a fundamental American interest that there's no smuggling. And you give them, that's You give them an incentive at the same time, you get to be responsible for doing a lot of the reconstruction in Gaza, which would be a huge economic boon for Egypt. But it means no smuggling. There has to be also a mechanism created to ensure any material coming into Gaza for reconstruction, rehabilitation, there is a mechanism to track it every step of the way to ensure no diversion of materials. And if there's any diversion of materials, it all stops. And you should be asking us to come up with a multilateral device to choke off the money to Hamas. That the era of Qatar supporting Hamas financially has to be over. So you can produce the outcome of the twin objectives of you get the recovery of all the hostages, alive and dead, and you do it sooner rather than later. And we work out what is an approach that guarantees Hamas will not be in control of Gaza. That's what I would be saying. I would focus very heavily on that, and I'd try to be very precise. Let's talk through exactly what guarantees that Hamas is not in control.
It all sounds reasonable to me and to many other people, but you know as well as I do that this Israeli prime minister and this Israeli government doesn't want to hear the words PA, Palestinian Authority. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Arab states won't go in for this kind of plan without some kind of Palestinian Authority input. And it's been a bottleneck since, I don't want to say day one, but very early in the war.
I would say two things. One, I think there's an understanding, Bibi in the end isn't going to oppose the PA inviting. That's no Arab states going in without some sort of Palestinian invitation. They're not going in, and I'll tell you what I heard from those who actually prepared to play a role. We're not going in to rescue Israel. We're going in to rescue Palestinians. We don't want Hamas. The Saudis and the Emiratis, maybe not the Qataris, but the Saudis and the Emiratis will be very clear with Trump. They don't want Hamas in control of Gaza. But the argument in Israel, we need to eliminate them, and they will want that too. That will prove to that. They understand you can't eliminate Hamas any more than we were able to eliminate ISIS. We defeated ISIS. We couldn't eliminate it. It's an ideology. It's an idea.
Mm-hmm.
When you defeat it, you weaken the ideology, but you don't eliminate it. They don't want Hamas in there. And if you ask them the argument that they'll be more impressed by us eliminating them, they will not be more impressed by it if you're going to be there another 5 years. If you're going to be there several more years, you had no normalization with Saudi Arabia. And if you really want to have an effective counter against the Iranians, it's not people who say you need normalization to have effective counter against the Iranians. It's true, but you have to explain it in greater detail. What does it mean? It means the Central Command has built an infrastructure for regional integration of defenses. It's an infrastructure, but it can't be fully implemented. It is today. You have a common sort of radar network, but it still takes calls. They're not connected. It still takes a phone call, literally, to say, okay, there's been a launch. They have common consoles, but they're not connected because there are limitations. You can create an integrated regional defense system where you create a division of labor so that you have a real defense. You have a set of defenses against missiles, drones, and cruise missiles. That infrastructure is there, but it won't be fully implemented unless you have normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I'm focusing right now only on the security side, not even the economic infrastructure side.
Right.
This whole, the deal that was struck to connect India with the Gulf, with Europe, and it would have run through Israel. That has dramatic implications for the well-being of the region as a whole, including the Israelis. So to get to regional, people hear slogans and they're not persuaded by it. October 7th, I don't need to tell you, sitting in Israel, Israel still suffers from the trauma of October 7th. And as long as the hostages are there, and as long as there's no accountability for what happened on October 7th, that trauma is not going away. There has to be, the worst disaster in Israel's history, there has to be a state inquiry commission. And that state inquiry commission will look at what was the concepcia. and the role of thinking, we can build up Hamas as an alternative to the PA. The notion that you can have calm with Hamas, and this was just the security establishment. It wasn't just a security establishment. It was a political establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to Libby's book, how he says that both Bennett and Lieberman, they wanted to carry the war. They wanted to try to wipe out Hamas. And his sober understanding prevented that. And the Shin Bet leaders will report, not just Ronan Bar. Other Shin Bet leaders will report that they saw this as a strategic mistake.
Right.
So the conceptual will be exposed. But it will also allow you to get at the issue, okay, what should the relationship be with the Palestinians? We have never had, really, from June 14th to June 19th, 1967, you had an interesting secret cabinet debate over what to do in the West Bank. And, it was literally everything you could imagine was sort of thrown out there for 5 days. And in the end, they decided to defer the issue.
The classic Israeli.
But you've not had a serious. Well, it's not hard to understand. I'll put it this way. There's no political leader I ever worked for who looked forward to making a decision they knew was going to produce an enormous political backlash. It's not unique to Israel. On the other hand, Israel's not a superpower, and Israel is drifting into a one-state reality. And if you pass the point where you can't reverse it, that one-state reality is going to guarantee that Israel lives in a perpetual conflict with being increasingly isolated. You look at the polling in this country. Democrats right now, a majority of Democrats are not sympathetic to Israel. It's extraordinary that that's the case. And I'll tell you, if you poll the younger evangelicals, their numbers, the older evangelicals are dramatically in favor of support of Israel. The younger evangelicals are not. They tend to reflect the younger demographic. So if you have a long-term one-state reality, it's going to have an impact, not just in the rest of the world, it's going to have an impact here as well. And it's an enduring conflict because the Palestinians, A, are not going away, and they're not going to give up their national identity. They have a national identity just as Israel. Israel's not going to, Palestinians and rejectionists who think Israel's going to disappear, they're wrong. They never understood the depth of the nature of the Israeli national identity, the civic culture. I look at the depth of that civic culture, and I say this when I go to campuses. I say, you know what Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas never understood? How deep is the sense of identity and the civic culture in Israel? And the best example of it is, it wasn't this government that responded to the needs of people in the South and people in the North. It was individual communities in Israel organizing themselves to basically meet the needs of people. I was up in Metula in January, and there were volunteers from all over the country cleaning up. They weren't connected to the government. Government did nothing. That sense of civic culture is so inbred. It is so much a part of the psychology and the sociology. And that's what the rejectionists have no idea. Partly because they don't have it. The Iranian regime, no, they don't have that kind of fundamental support. Hezbollah may hope they have it. Maybe they had it before, at least with the Shia, but with no one else. They look at their own circumstance and they project it onto Israel. That's why when they see the division, they think, we couldn't tolerate that. We couldn't live with that, but Israel could.
And real final question to you, Dennis, on that point, on that issue, for all of us who care deeply about not just the peace process, but also ultimately a two-state outcome, because it really likely is the only realistic and plausible option. What do you tell people when you speak to them either privately or publicly about prospects for the future for attaining a two-state solution?
There's a long haul, that it's not, I worked in this, for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the Israelis and Palestinians, I would say we're at the lowest ebb. during the whole period I worked on this, because a complete loss of faith. Israelis are convinced that if you had a Palestinian state, it'll be led by Hamas. And Palestinians are convinced that Israelis are completely indifferent to them. They look at the loss, the death and destruction in Gaza, and they think Israelis are completely indifferent to them. So it's a long haul. I'll tell you what I think has to be done. First, you have to understand a one-state outcome is a guarantee for perpetual conflict, because these two national identities, there's always been a conflict over two national movements competing for the same space, and they're not going to coexist in one space. So I say where we have to start now, given the trauma on each side, and trauma on each side means each side can identify and absorb and identify only with their own pain, not with the other sides. First, we have to reestablish the idea that cooperation, functional cooperation, can be done in a way that offers benefits, because that you have to reestablish that. The reality is there are areas where functional cooperation, whether it's on environment, water, health, they take place anyway, but they have no exposure. There needs to be visibility to it so people can begin to see, okay, we can cooperate. That's number one. Number two, you need to use the Arabs, because the Saudi normalization is a lever, frankly, on the Israelis and the Palestinians. Because the Saudis can say, look, we're not going to allow you to dictate to us. Effectively, look at the Abraham Accord. What was the UAE saying? They're saying, you know what? We're not forgetting the Palestinians, but we have things that are fundamentally in our interests, because there's a lot to be gained by our relationship with Israel in areas that matter to us. And we're not going to deny ourselves what's in our interests, because you have a leadership that's incapable of ever making peace with the Israelis. So you need them to use the lever, but also on Israel, say, look, this is what we require from you and the Palestinians. That allows you to begin to move forward. So practical cooperation, use the Arabs. And there needs to be, use the Arabs also. You look at the educational systems in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, how they've been fundamentally transformed. That does need to be applied also to the Palestinians. From the standpoint of them if they're going to be a state, turning them into a state that can be a 21st century state as well. So those are, when I lay this out, it means it's a long timeline. I would create, in addition to what I said, a parallel set of obligations on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. And I'll close with this. One of the failures, I think, from the past, including in my time, I can get into failures. I should have thought before we went to Camp David about creating a common script where each leader was going to spell out publicly the concessions the broad concessions they would make on the core issues before going. Because once they did that, the pressures against them, the backlash against them would have given them an enormous stake to reach an agreement quickly to show the payoffs. Mm-hmm. So there's things you have to do from a negotiating standpoint. But fundamentally, one thing we didn't do. When I said this two movements competing for the same space, there was mutual recognition in 1993, but it was never an exchange of accepting the legitimacy of the other side. It was accepting the fact of the other side. The Palestinians never accepted the historic Jewish connection to the land. And the Israelis never accepted the Palestinians are people who have a right to self-determination. But before they can act on that right, they have to demonstrate certain things. And Israel, for its part, it can't act on the ground in a way that makes a Palestinian state impossible. Even if we're maybe a generation away from being able to produce a Palestinian state, you can't have actions now that make it impossible in the future. You can't have actions now that guarantee a one-state reality, and you can't undo it.
Right.
That's what Minister Smotrich is trying to do.
He certainly is. Dennis, we'll leave it there. We could have gone for another hour. Trust me.
Sure.
The book is called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. Where can people find the book?
Probably the easiest way is just to go online. You can get it from Amazon.
Okay.
And they deliver very quickly.
Okay. So people should do that. And next time you come on, Dennis, we'll talk about the NBA playoffs and the Golden State Warriors and more positive things than Bezalel Smotrich and his plans for the West Bank.
I would just say if Steph Curry hadn't been hurt, they definitely would have reached it to the conference finals, and who knows from there.
I believe that to be true.
Not that I'm too pained by it, but okay.
Well, we are recording this Wednesday evening, so we'll find out what happens later today, I think, right?
Yeah, tonight. I think I'm not optimistic tonight because they still don't have Curry.
Right. With that, Dennis, take care. It's good to see you.
See you. Gary, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks again to Dennis Ross for his generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening.